Hello, I'm Megan Catherin, and this is my spiritual adventures. I'm going to start with what feels like a beginning for me, but probably isn't. There is no beginning and no end. When we look back through life, we can see how things relate to the now or the experience. But right now, I'm going to talk about death as the catalyst for my spiritual awakening. Now, 2008, my dad passed. It was a bit of a surprise when he was diagnosed with cancer whilst in France on a holiday. So it was a pretty traumatic experience to get him home and my mum home. And within 7 weeks, he had passed. There wasn't any way of saving him. It had been dormant and was now a secondary cancer. And it was, as I said, a big shock. This was a catalyst for an awakening in me of what I came to recognize as sadness. I understood that I had my melancholy, but I wasn't a stranger to depression and that's probably another episode, but as in talking, not episode. Anyway, you know what I mean. It was basically the beginnings of awakening to the spiritual side of me, to the energetic side of me. But I didn't understand it at that stage. It was 2008 and I was very busily with my own kids and working life and as an interior designer. And all this stuff began to happen in the sense that I just couldn't stop crying. And I just went, oh, yeah, that's grief. You know, you don't know what it's going to be like till it happens attitude. But I was waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning in tears. I was, just doing my daily business and these tears would roll out. It was like floodgates had been opened. And I was pretty shocked by how it was happening. This went on for a couple of years and we'd come to call it in my family, mum's having an emotional, because I would just start crying and there was nothing anyone could do. And the kids and my husband would say, do you want a hug, mum? And I'd, no, it's fine. I'm just having an emotional. You know, women, you've been there in your period, right? You just can't stop it. And you don't even know what you're crying about. But I would assume it was my dad, or it was my brain would tell me it was my dad, the death of my dad. I'm missing my dad. And yet I hadn't even thought about my dad when the trigger happened or when it began, right? So I didn't know what it was triggering it. It just would happen. This went on for a couple of years and I started to realize there's something else. I'm seeing this little gap. I can recognize I'll start crying or I'm crying. And then I go, oh, it's about dad. It's like my brain or my ego would need to link it to something discernible, something obvious, something understandable. Oh, your dad. And I had what I call my airy fairy friend in my life at that stage. She was very into all the hippie alternative stuff that I just went, oh, yeah, that's your thing, darling. And I kept all that stuff very at bay and kept my life very much to, the kids and our friendship through that. And through alcohol, having a drink, doing all those things that you do to get by. So I started to recognize this gap. And I thought, there's something more to this. What was also bubbling up, or what wanted to grab my attention, I think, and I didn't really know, it was like my spirit was leading me. Not that I even talked about my spirit at that point, or my soul, or any of those kind of, descriptions. But I had this sense of it's time. So I approached her and she said, come and have a session with me. And at that stage, she was always doing something new, some new modality. And I didn't know what they were all even called modalities at that stage, or, these were all foreign words to me. I think it was called life alignment at that stage. I don't even know if that exists anymore or what it is. And Bowen therapy, and I don't know. So she was saying all these words to me and I didn't know what they were, but something inside of me said, you need to go to her. Just allow it, go with this. And I felt trustworthy enough. Spirit, life, universe had given me someone that I could trust, in the sense that I felt like I could control it, because I knew that I could say to her, and it didn't matter how rudely I said it, she'd be still love me as my friend, that I could say, no, that's enough. I don't want to know this. No, we're stopping. So I went along to this, and she started using a pendulum, and I was like, what the hell is this? And she was doing muscle testing and had lists, and she was putting her hands all over me, Bowen therapy, right? All these things. And I was like, oh God. Now I can't even remember some of the things that came up. I understood some of it. I didn't understand some of it. I talked through it because I'm a talker and I'm an emotional person. I've always been interested in emotional intelligence. So I talk things, but this was a bit different, and a bit different. And yeah, so what I remember the most, and what was sort of a really important part of this, and that's why it's stuck in my memories, is the fact that she said to me, oh, don't be alarmed, but your dad's standing to the left of you. And I went, yeah, I know. And she was gobsmacked. She looked at me like, whoa, shock horror, this is not what I thought you would have said. And she said, yeah, he's there. And I'm like, yep, I know this. And she said, I can't believe you're admitting that. You've never spoken of something like that before. And I said, because I've never wanted to. It's something I've held back. I've kind of been in disbelief. But the truth, when I thought about it, was I've been feeling my dad on and off, and maybe that's what would start the crying. Even though there wasn't a brain thought, I was feeling his energy. That's perhaps part of it. It wasn't all of it. And then there was also the fact that my grandmother had died quite some years prior when the kids were little, and I still would feel her at times doing the dishes or hanging my washing out, and I'd feel her with me. And I'd say, hi, Grandma, in my mind. But I never would put it out there as, it's a thing. I also had, my grandfather was very sick when my first child was born. And this was his first great grandchild. He was very excited by this, but he had ended up in hospital. And we knew he was going to pass because he'd been avoiding hospital like the plague. And he only ended up in hospital because he could no longer say no to that. And we basically went from my hospital where I birthed her to his hospital and took her there to see him, because we knew this would be his only chance. And I left the hospital knowing he would pass, knowing this was the end. And within 2 more weeks of that time frame, he had died. Now, after getting that phone call from my mum, I just went into this fear, this absolute fear that I was going to walk into the baby's room in the middle of the night and that my grandfather would be there, that I would see him. Now, I wasn't scared of my grandfather at all, but I just knew that and I'd never voiced this kind of stuff, but obviously this was a thing inside of me that said, this is the truth of life for me, that he would come to visit her before he crossed over completely, and I would possibly see him. Now, why I thought that, I don't know, but I just knew it, and I was frightened, and I didn't say anything to my husband, and I was kind of like knocking on the door as I'm coming in, sort of like, Granddad, if you're there, don't show yourself, because I knew that if he showed himself, or if I saw this, I couldn't undo it. I could not go back, and I didn't want to kind of recognize all this. But life has a sneaky way of bringing these things to you regardless. So even though I didn't want to admit this stuff, years later, when my dad passed, and the constant crying and the depths of my spiritual awakening coming up and needing to be seen, and me following something in me that said, go to your girlfriend, allow this to happen. And having that moment where I finally voiced, yes, I know. Yes, I know he's there. And it was a big moment. I was in tears because I'd voiced it, not because he was there so much. And I started to recognize this is what the gap is. There's this stuff. There's me, there's this other side of life that wants to be seen and heard and felt, or needs to be. It's bubbling up and needs to be seen. And his death was the catalyst for that spiritual awakening. I started to recognize that's what my dad had brought to me. That's what his passing was, a gift in itself. I still was very raw, and it took me some time to feel comfortable enough to even look at a photo of my dad. But it changed my value. It changed my life. It changed my trajectory. Yet at the same time, it all felt like it was supposed to be. It started to feel fated, if you call it that, or destined, or triggered in time, as if it was all supposed to be there. So I wanted to share that as the beginnings of my spiritual adventures, referencing to my past in hindsight and so forth. And when you see things differently, it's very different when you're in the midst of something to when you're later looking at it, what was really going on, those different perspectives of vision and experience. So this bubbling up of sadness, and I didn't realize how much sadness sat in me at all. But over the years of the spiritual journey, so by this time we're, 2008, he died, 2010, I'm starting to begin to open up to this. And I went to my girlfriend a couple more times over the next few months, to when I felt like it was a bit overwhelming, I'd go back to her again, and something else would be opened. And I don't even remember what those things were. It was just those little baby steps. And the interesting thing was that this sadness kept coming, and over the years it's come. And over the years I've had intuitive people, spiritual people say to me, wow, there's so much sadness in you. I didn't feel sad. I mean, sure, we all have our sadness, but I didn't feel like, oh my God, I'm soaking in it. Yet it was part of me, in the same way that some people will say, I'm not an angry person, and yet so much anger, resentment sits below. And I still have had my anger and resentment and all those emotions that I didn't know existed, and they need to come through the doorway of you. That is what awakening is about. That is what the spiritual journey is about, to let it all out, to see it, to pick it up and have a look at it and decide, what am I taking forward from here, and what can go, to lighten the load, to enlighten, right? So anyway, that's my first. I can go on, but this is video number 1, and I give this to you in the hope that you can see some of this within yourself. Everybody's journey opens and awakens differently. But for me, death was definitely a catalyst. And death now I see as a catalyst for so many things. I have had so many deaths and rebirths within myself. It's ridiculous. And I don't view death in the same way. I can still feel very sad about someone's passing, because it is a loss that you must become accustomed to, and it can always bring a lot of things out. But the floodgates had been opened, the doors had been released, the locks, but there was no locks anymore. I couldn't stop it. And here we are, 12 years later, going, wow, okay, let's start sharing my spiritual adventures and see if this helps you in any way. Thanks, guys. See you on the other side in the next episode. Yeah, me and technology.